welcome officially to this event, which is called Supporting Newly Arrived Migrants During Lockdown, Community Responses. My name is Alessio D'Angelo. I am Associate Professor at the University of Nottingham, and I'm, one of the people involved in organizing this event, alongside my colleague from NIESR, Dr. Chiara Manzoni, who's a senior social researcher there.
Hello.
And then we've got Laura Marziale from Creative Ground, also there. And myself, Chiara, and Laura will be chairing the breakout sessions later on. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And then working in the background, but also making this possible, we've got Rachel Tukey, also from NIESR, who's the person who's posting messaging on behalf of NIESR. She's again working in the background troubleshooting just in case. And then we've got Amy Lines, also as part of the team. She's a research officer in the research center here in Nottingham, and she may appear in some of the parallel groups later, taking some notes as well as joining the discussion. Okay, you can see the logos here on the first slide. So just to say that at the onset, this is part of a series of partnership events organized jointly by the University of Nottingham and by NIESR, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. On the NIESR side, this stems from a research project led by Chiara, which was funded by the ESRC. And at Nottingham, we received some funding from the SPA, the Social Policy Association, to support these and other events I'll tell you more about in a moment. So, roughly speaking, this is the program. We'll probably be a little bit flexible on it, but the general plan is that once I've done with all the introductions, we are going to have a bit of a presentation from me and Chiara, which is informed from some research work we've been doing over the past few months. So we'd like to share some of our emerging findings with you, precisely about the impact of COVID-19 and school closures on newly arrived migrants, and including refugees and EAL students in primary and secondary schools in the UK. Well, my research has been mainly focusing on the UK, but actually Chiara has been working also in Italy and Spain, and we know we've got some guests here from different European countries, so hopefully we can discuss also in comparative terms. Around 3 o'clock, as I mentioned, after we had a bit of a Q&A and general discussions about what I'm going to present, we are going to divide you into 2 or 3 breakout groups, depending on how many people we have connected at that point. And that is going to be an opportunity to discuss some of the themes and I suppose the underpinning questions of this event. In smaller groups, we would like to have some kind of exchange of experience, exchange of, ideas around practice and so on. And we were thinking to do that by creating groups in terms of whether people are more interested or primarily working in primary or secondary schools. So in a moment, I'm actually going to ask you to raise your virtual hands to indicate which group you prefer to join. So I'm going to call the 2 groups separately, and I will ask you to raise your hand. And then again, Rachel and the rest of the team, that they'll do their best to allocate you in groups according to those preferences, okay? We'll do what we can depending on what the ratios are. So I hope you've all identified the right button to raise your hand, your electronic hand. So if you have, and if you would like to talk about primary schools, could you please raise your hand? So if you want to do primary schools, please raise your hand now, and we will try to capture that. If you can kindly keep your hand up. And if Rachel or someone can give me a sign to confirm that that has been registered.
Yeah, that's been registered.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So if you don't mind lowering your hand at this point, shall we double check, Rachel, with secondary schools, or are you okay?
Yeah, we could check with secondary.
Okay, so please now, if you would like to do secondary schools instead, if you can raise your hand now, and we'll try to redirect you to the appropriate room later on. So we're counting for secondary schools, making it sound like it's an auction or something. I don't know why. Anyway, okay. So that should be secondary schools. Rachel, are you okay with that?
Yeah, we've got that.
Okay. Thank you ever so much. So you can lower your hands now. And again, whilst we go on with the presentations, the breakout rooms are going to be organized, and you will be, if I'm not mistaken, allocated automatically. So once we get to that point, you will get a message. You just need to click OK, and you will enter the right room. Okay. And after those breakout rooms, we will come back again in a plenary, and we will exchange some, well, summary of what emerged from those breakout sessions. Okay, the very last thing I need to do before starting for real is just to let you know that we are recording the video of this presentation, and we will put it online, but only the first part where Chiara and myself are presenting the findings. So we won't capture any other image or anything else. As far as the rest of the event is concerned, we are using in the background that software to do live transcription of the meeting. So we will record the audio of everything and do a live transcription so that we have a text. But that is only done for the purpose of taking notes, and we will delete everything after the meeting. So we're not going to keep it. We're not going to kind of publish it anywhere. So just in terms of GDPR, I want to let you know that this is what's going to happen, okay? If you've got any particular question about that, you may want to send a direct message to the account called NIESR, which is Rachel, but I hope this was straightforward enough. So in practice, we are recording the presentation, we'll put it online, but nothing else of what you may want to share will be kind of circulated under your name or anything like that. Okay, so I hope you're all ready to start, and I will take you through some points. So again, as you know, one of the questions that, well, we are interrogating ourselves about with this event, and I'm sure some of you have been doing the same, is how have migrant pupils and students been affected by what's been happening over the last year or so? So COVID, the pandemic, and the related lockdown and school closures. And one of the reasons we decided to organize this series of events is because we notice how schools have been very much at the center of the debates around COVID and related policy interventions, not just in this country, throughout Europe at least, but in fact, very little has been said, or at least has been very little in the public domain, about the specific experience and the specific needs of migrant and children who use English as an additional language in England, for example. So there hasn't been as much as we may have liked, we may have expected. Sarah and I suppose, we've tried to make our little contribution to address this gap. So the information, the emerging findings we are presenting in the coming slides are based on two pieces of research that we've been working on. Chiara has been primarily working with a number of schools across Europe, talking to teachers and having group discussions in schools. And my research, which is at early stages at the moment, has been focusing on interviewing stakeholders, first sector, public sector organizations, NGOs, and other organizations that support students, schools, and families. If you visit that website there, you can find some more information and some blogs that we've written related to our research. Okay, so the first point, I suppose, is to ask ourselves, what is it that we know and we do not know about newly arrived migrants in schools? Probably the second question to me would be, why is it that we know so little? Well, relatively little. When we talk about newly arrived migrant children, we are adopting that kind of usual definition. I mean, usually the term is used to identify students who arrived to the host country over the last 3 years. It's a definition which is also connected to kind of targeted funding. Other than that, certainly in the UK, data on migrant students and the different types of migrant status is relatively limited. We do have ESL statistics, as we know, from the school census. So we know what proportion of students in primary and secondary schools are EAL, as in using English as an additional language. But we also know that there is kind of a wide range of situations that go under that very broad label. Also because we know that EAL in itself is not an indicator of disadvantage necessarily. There's, again, it's quite a diverse population, if we could even use that term. What will be much more useful will be measures of English proficiency, for example, in England. So knowing to what extent students speak English. And you may recall that that kind of information was collected in the school census just for a very, very short period of time, just for a couple of years, and then was discontinued by the Department for Education for whatever reason. So it is a population for which we don't have as much data as we'd like to. But we do know a lot from educational studies and sociological research. I mean, there's been a lot published before COVID and before the lockdown in terms of migrant children in schools. And if you refer to that literature, of course, you easily realize that for migrant children in particular, schools are not just an important site for learning and language acquisition, but are very often a crucial space of, well, social integration and emotional well-being, and a site of social integration for the whole family. We also know, and I think that applies to most of Europe, that in many cases, targeted resources and targeted interventions are relatively limited. And when there are, one of the problems, and yet you tend to have kind of one size fits all sort of approaches, rather than really a differentiation between the different groups or different needs of migrant children. Something that many have in common, depending on their migratory histories, and that is particularly true for refugees and asylum seekers, for example, is relatively higher risks of mental health issues. And from a policy perspective, I suppose that we could say that very often, not necessarily from the school point of view, but certainly from the policymakers' point of view, the presence of migrants in a school environment has very often been framed in terms of a burden and a problem rather than necessarily an opportunity. And well, I may want to elaborate a bit more on that later on. Now, talking about the lockdown, what is it that we know about the impact of lockdowns and school closure? I mean, it's obviously still a very recent event, and we'll need longer term research to look at the longer term impact. We do know that lockdowns have been affecting everyone, every student. So this is obviously not just about migrant students, but we also know, or we can infer, that many newly arrived migrants have been suffering more than others, quite disproportionately. I mean, for a number of reasons, issues to do with language, of course, their own language, and the level of English proficiency in the overall family. So the ability or inability of the family to support students, for example, with homework, lack of knowledge of the school system, or more limited knowledge of the school system, and so more difficulties in navigating that. General issues to access to education, which again we had beforehand, but may have been exacerbated now with the move to online learning because of digital divide, because of lack of access to technology or the internet, for example. Now, I'm aware, and actually I want to highlight that these points are pretty general, if not generic, and I want to emphasize the fact that really what is important and what very often is missing is the differentiation between different groups. It's about identifying different needs of students. And really, if you want to do that, what you need to take is an intersectional approach where you look at the needs of individual students, not just in terms of EAL, not just in terms of language, but of course at the intersection between that and ethnicity, in our case, migration status, but also in terms of gender, class, and special educational needs and disability, and so on. So of course, what we focus on here is just one element of a much more complex jigsaw, if you want. There are groups which have been affected more and disproportionately. So once again, I make reference here to young refugees and asylum seekers. In one of the last interviews that I did with a practitioner, I mean, she was describing young refugees studying in the UK as a doubly lost generation, because, you know, very often young refugees are defined as a lost generation because of what they've been going through. And then more recently, we've been talking about the students who were in school during the lockdown, in some cases as a lost generation. Well, the young refugees and asylum seekers who came to the UK just at the start of the pandemic or around that period really found themselves at the intersection of those problems. And so clearly, there's been even additional problems in terms of opportunities for socialization, for example, more difficulties in meeting their needs in terms of, well, supporting bereavement or supporting the psychological traumas they may have been going through. We had some very good practice in this country of kind of welcome activities, those mechanisms such as the School of Sanctuary, for example, which in some cases have been operating nonetheless, but in some other cases have been affected quite significantly by the lockdown. So a lot of problems, one compounding the other. Something which is emerged from some of the interviews, which I personally found quite interesting, is that in some cases, the people I was talking to who work with migrant students were also highlighting some positive impacts, some potential good things that happened before the lockdown. And I'm presenting this here with a big question mark, but maybe it's a good point to be discussed. More than one interviewee talked about online schooling and entering the school system through online schooling for the first time, and particularly with regard to refugee students, as a way in which opportunities for additional trauma and victimization in the school environment, for example, could have been more kind of reduced or controlled, at least in the beginning, a kind of softer introduction to the school environment. Some highlighted how, of course, online learning for somebody who doesn't speak English very well creates a lot of problems, particularly in terms of oral communication, but may present some advantages in terms of written English and the ability to access forms of support online pretty quickly. Clearly, well, whether they wanted it or not, teachers throughout the UK had been forced to shift to online teaching. And so more expertise has been developed. And so in some cases, it's been more easy to provide online language support. And there is also something to be said about the opportunities that in some cases there have been for some young people to practice the home language more, simply because they were spending more time at home. Clearly with the disadvantages I was mentioning before, but again, from a psychological point of view and from the point of view of developing language or maintaining language skills in general, there may have been some positives as well as the negatives there. But of course, it's early days. But one of the things we wanted to understand with our projects was really what has been the different role of different actors in dealing with all those issues, in dealing with all those dimensions. So what has been the role of the public sector? What has been the role of schools that Chiara is going to talk about in a moment? What has been the role of the community sector and NGOs? And clearly then, what is missing in this picture is what's been done by families and by the young people themselves. And that's another important aspect, because really, I think something we can all agree on is that the voice of the families and the voice of the young people is really being missing in the debate, even more so when we talk about migrant and refugee students or EAL students. And in fact, in all honesty, I'm afraid that even in the research I've done, most of what I get is a filtered voice through the experience of practitioners. But what I would like personally to be able to do later on is having opportunity to talk directly to the young people. I can tell you a bit more about that later. Okay, let's try to look at some of these actors. And let's start with the public sector. I mean, to keep it very brief, I suppose the general sense is that there's really been a lack of coherent policy responses at national level, and that is not just true for the UK. I mean, it's something that we've seen in Spain, in Italy, just to mention countries I'm more familiar with. I mean, in fact, lack of coherent policy responses make it sound as if there was any policy response. I think this is really issues that were completely off the agenda, not just missing from the agenda, but being actively removed from the agenda. I mean, in the UK, it's just news of a few weeks ago that Ofsted, so the agency that does the kind of monitoring assessment of schools, it's kind of restructuring in such a way in which there's not going to be an EAL national coordinator anymore, apparently. So it's going to be forgotten even more. So not great news on national level. At local authority level, there's a mine of very good practices. There are some examples of EAL and achievement teams at council level, both city council and county council, for example. There are some mechanisms of regional partnerships that are quite successful, and I'm not going to showcase anyone in particular today, but we will later on when we publish. So there are good practices of school support. There are forums for EAL teachers. There's a lot of online guidelines and information hubs, which is one of the things we are trying to map. I think maybe in that respect, one issue is that this is done at local level, precisely. And there's an awful lot of repetition and duplication. So you see the very same things and the very same documents sometimes being produced in one local authority, and then you've got the local authorities next door doing the very same thing from scratch. And in some cases, some more coordination may be useful and may benefit, particularly those areas, those geographical areas that have a low proportion of migrant children, because precisely they may not have a lot of critical mass to do a lot of investment, but they could benefit from, well, picking the brain of what happens in other places. Okay, so in this very kind of complex context in terms of the public sector, I'm now going to hand it over to Chiara to hear a bit more in terms of what's been happening in the schools, so the school responses. Chiara, over to you.
Hello, thank you, Alessio, for your introduction. Yeah, as Alessio explained to you, I will focus on school responses, and in particular, the research I did focuses on COVID-19 and school closure and on the impact for migrant students. So the aims are to explore the challenges that COVID-19 has raised for schools and teachers in general, and in particular to understand the impact of the lockdown and school closure for newly arrived migrants, and also investigate school responses and practices used to support newly arrived migrants. So I conducted the research during the first lockdown between April and October, and I carried out online interviews with head teachers and teachers, and I did so with schools in England, in Italy, in Spain, and in Switzerland. If you can pass to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so the research documents a wide range of strategies put in place by individual schools to overcome the barriers that Alessio briefly mentioned before. For example, to overcome IT barriers, some schools were able to deliver Chromebooks and provide internet access if needed, or teachers deliver digital literacy lessons through phone calls or video to explain how to connect, how to access the school material, how to upload material. And in some cases, schools realized that the IT available devices that they could offer was not enough. And particularly in the case of the UK or in the case of Spain, the government or third sector organization came too late or not for all. So schools basically prepare and printed paperwork materials that was in some cases delivered door to door by teachers. And materials included pens and papers and also study books for specific year groups. And so what teacher told me is that schools provided emotional support rather than educational support, and the timetable and also the type of activities were tailored to support pupils emotionally. And basically teachers were also busy doing motivational calls with students to keep them engaged with the homeschooling and to keep them motivated. And teachers were also supporting families in dealing with practical necessities, including how to access funding to buy food. So they were signposting to food banks or directed to local and national help organizations. And in some cases, schools also became food banks, and teachers were redeployed to distribute food to those in need. The next slide. And to support migrants, also teachers offer individualized support through phone or video lessons. And this was to explain tasks or contents. Most of the teachers in Italy were doing live lessons. And for example, in the case of primary schools, lessons were organized for a small group of up to 6 or 7 pupils. And this was just to allow them to see and chat between them and to interact a bit. And they explained to me that they were doing like interactive activities, starting by doing stretching exercise or by singing. And in some cases, they were also recording self-explanatory videos for pupils to follow really the basic, like really with easy instructions. In the case of secondary schools, lessons were offered more for small and bigger groups, and also teachers offer individualized support for newly arrived migrants, and also one-to-one live lessons. And to boost motivation, schools were using social media or interactive projects to engage with young people, like drama project or video or cooking or music like rap or a lot of different activities. So they were really creative in finding the way to engage with them. Then next one. To overcome language barrier and facilitate the communication with students and parents, schools were translating all materials, and they were using like interpreting services or multilingual teaching assistants, as well as language lines. And another interesting practice was to connect newly arrived migrants with native speaking peers to ensure that they have a higher opportunity to interact in their native language. And teacher told me that they also conducted a home visit to key family, because some pupils basically went off the radar and teacher had very little or no contact. So they put in place welfare visits and also welfare call with parents, that just to be sure that everything was going okay, and they were still in the country and everything was all right. Also, schools were sending newsletter to parents to explain the school's approach and more importantly, to help them navigate government guidelines. And all schools explained that parent ambassadors were reported as a crucial resource to connect with families, and this was basically particularly crucial in the case of hard-to-reach groups like Roma. And in my next slide, I just highlighted what were basically the tools, resources, and platform used by schools. So in Italy, for example, because they were delivering live lessons, they were using Google Meet or Google Classroom or Cisco WebEx. In the UK, they were using Twinkle and Class Dojo to communicate with parents as well, and set work tailored to pupils' need, as well as their proper school website and YouTube channels with a lot of videos or materials accessible to those with that were able to connect. And they were also using Rosetta Stone to create material for EAL students, or Flash Academy, or online quizzes and different activities. And in the case of Spain, they were using like Zoom, Telegrams, WhatsApp, or Aulas. It was less focused on a specific platform that were able to support EAL, like EAL pupils, and it was more like a general platform to communicate with families and with pupils. So I don't know now if you want to continue with your presentation, Alessia.
Yeah, thank you, Chiara. Thanks a lot for that. So that's what's been happening in the schools, and again, Chiara started to have a relatively detailed picture of the variety of interventions. I am currently looking at the role of the first sector, broadly meant, so including large NGOs and organizations. And if you work on these issues in the UK, you're probably familiar with organizations such as NALDIC, the Education Endowment Foundation, the Bell Foundation, which in different ways, but over the last few months, they made quite an effort in terms of producing targeted materials and various forms of support, various events and training opportunities have been organized. What's been affected more in terms of the ability to operate, however, has been the very rich and diverse world of small and very small local community groups, community organization, migrant and BME-led organizations that in the past few years, I mean, it's been going on for years, there's been this kind of well-developed history, in particular in some areas, of supplementary classes and Saturday schools, community schools, all these realities of kind of community-led education support, which is in some cases are run completely independent in community halls and things like that, or in churches for some communities or other places of worship. And in some other cases, working in collaboration and in cooperation with the schools. Again, it's very difficult to generalize because it's a very kind of fragmented reality of very small organizations. But from the conversations I've been having so far, I mean, there's been many of them which has been affected financially also in the sense that many of them tend to run with the input of volunteers, which during COVID for economic reasons, but also because of the lockdown may have been less able to operate. Some of these organizations really rely on face-to-face delivery, and in some cases they didn't have the resources or necessarily the skills to shift to online particularly easily. And quite surprisingly, and to my knowledge, but please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's been much done in terms of providing alternative sources of funding or targeted interventions to conversely allow these organizations to continue, or rather to enhance their kind of work during the pandemic. We've seen in some places fundraising campaigns. There's been fundraising campaigns, particularly with regard to the IT. So some very local groups have been collecting money or even collecting used devices to be then distributed within the communities, but clearly nothing kind of coordinated in a national or regional way by definition, and maybe it's not necessarily a bad way, but from what we can say, the level of support has been going down from that type of organization. Okay, wrapping things up, I mean, to conclude, I don't know whether we can conclude, but maybe a couple of takeaway points. Well, one is that really it's important to raise awareness and to do more for these students, but the prerequisite to do that, in my view at least, is really to think intersectionally, and so to look at the intersection of different needs and different backgrounds of the students. We are clearly now worried about the short-term impact and interventions, but in terms of the long-term impact, we need to keep monitoring the situation. I mean, in terms of research, because it's only in the long term that we will see what the actual educational outcomes of the last year are going to be, and the extent to which there will be an actual widening of the achievement gap. But maybe there are also some positive things to learn from. There are some lessons we can use to build upon. You know, there is this idea that after the lockdown, maybe we shouldn't go back to normal, but we should try to move forward to something better. We don't necessarily see the premises of that right now, but maybe at least by, well, coming together and exchanging experiences and kind of building or helping building more kind of networks or communities of practice, we can help kind of moving into that direction. And so again, these are the ideas that have been underpinning our work so far. You can find some more information on the website. We are running a conference later in May about these issues, more of an event aimed at academics and researchers. And yeah, we're running these events because we hope they become an opportunity to interact with each other. And because of that reason, I'm not to shut up and just see if there's any question or any comment from anyone for me or for Chiara before we then go into smaller group